Good morning. I've talked in the past about wolves. I've hit on it somewhat, I consider quite lightly. This morning, I'm going to talk it quite in depth because it is such a serious issue. Not only here in Wyoming, but across the country, anywhere that there are wolves. I want people to become thoroughly informed. I think this is what I'm going to offer here is a very thorough amount of information without getting into complete in-depth detail, but it's still going to be somewhat detailed. It's going to be fairly lengthy. So when you start watching this program, plan on sitting down for a time because I'm going to talk for quite a while, longer than I've ever talked before. I'm going to start from the very beginning. As I see it, from my experience as a lifetime hunter involved in this area from many aspects, born into an outfitting family, outfitted big game hunters right here in the valley where I and my wife still live, and my son and his wife. My granddad and my dad were outfitters and guides. Years before I was born, in the 40s. I was born in 1949, and as I grew up in this business, in this family that we had, which was very successful, it was my life. It was my life. That's what I grew up in. It's still my life. It's my life every day. And I see it being destroyed. Early on, to do with wolves, Yellowstone Park put in place a man that was the first man on predator control in Yellowstone Park just after World War I. He killed, shot, and trapped wolves out of Yellowstone Park for quite a number of years. He was our neighbor from 3 miles away from where we lived here in the valley. His name was Ted Ogston. He lived to be 95 years old. And he and his wife lived just simply 3 miles from us. He felt that he eradicated the wolves out of Yellowstone Park. He said, Randy said there could have been 1 or possibly 2 wolves. He said, but that's as I see it, because he was an energetic fella. He spent all of his time out in the outdoors hunting and trapping. And after that, to the best of my knowledge, they never had a man on predator control in Yellowstone Park. It wasn't just limited to wolves. It was coyotes, probably a few wolverine, and a lot of grizzly bears. And a lot of these animals were baited in by Ted shooting buffalo with a first model Savage, Model 20 Savage, chambered in .253. He bought the rifle and several cases of ammunition, 87 grain Remington ammunition using a 87 grain Loveloy bullet. It was very important that these sort of things were done. I also knew many people in the area here, as I happened to grow up at the right time to have known these energetic people, ranchers, outfitters, outdoorsmen, guides, you name it. They were involved in eradicating wolves out of this part of the area. And I visited at great length with many of these people, but mostly with Ted Ogson because he was a close neighbor. And some years later, there was a man involved with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department by the name of Calvin King, and he was a biologist. I have a book printed. Bring the book. I have a book printed written by Calvin King that details the decline of game in the Bighorn Basin. Where I live here is considered the Bighorn Basin of Wyoming. And there are detailed accounts of tremendous amounts of wolves that were killed over short periods of years, and of the amounts of bounties paid out by the game department for taking these animals out. It's very, very clear that there was a purpose. Here's the book, folks. This is a very rare, it's a rarity. This book is a rarity. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. And I can go into a few details here by my memory through a short period of years, a handful of years. For instance, there was 3,500 wolves taken out in portions of Wyoming and bounties paid on these wolves that were taken out. You understand, we had an awful lot of wolves. It wasn't just wolves that were taken out, mountain lions, coyotes, badgers, skunks, foxes, and one thing another. And after this sort of thing, our game herds rebuilt themselves because we didn't have this tremendous prey base that was taking their lives every time that they turned their head, everywhere they went, in all portions of Wyoming. And my dollars and everybody else's dollars that paid in whatever we bought, a trapping license, a hunting license, a fishing license, or whatever, all these funds were used to build the most tremendous game herds of almost anywhere in North America. Here in Wyoming, right here in the valley where I live, the North Fork of the Shoshone River, east of the east entrance of Yellowstone Park. We live halfway between Cody and Yellowstone, roughly halfway. And this is a tremendous migratory corridor for all of our game animals: elk, deer, moose, bighorn sheep, and so forth. And all these things that I'm relating to you, from Ted Ogston's tremendous work in Yellowstone to all other people's involvement, detailed in this book here by Calvin King. It gives up everybody a very detailed and an enlightened picture of what was created by the proper approach, so that we could enjoy, everybody could enjoy this tremendous opportunity to hunt, to feed themselves and their family, and so forth, besides just simply seeing these animals and photographing these animals. Unfortunately, things began changing. They actually were starting to change to do with Yellowstone Park. Yellowstone Park has been a tremendous draw to this part of the country. And in a like aspect, it's been a tremendous detriment, and I repeat, detriment to this part of the country, because I firmly believe that these wolves would not have been introduced, not reintroduced, introduced, because they were never here to begin with. There was this entirely different subspecies of wolf that lived here. Canadian gray wolves never lived here in the United States. This wasn't what lived here. So don't be misled. Don't be misled by these environmental terrorists, because this is what these people are that have been involved in bringing these wolves in here. They're environmental terrorists. And in 1994, and I believe the best that I can remember, in a March Wildlife of Wyoming Wildlife magazine put out by the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, basically it promotes and pats the Wyoming Game and Fish Department on the back. They're patting themselves on the back here. And a fellow by the name of Mark Brasino had an article in that Wyoming Wildlife that stated that the missing link to our wildlife and to our ecosystem was the wolf. Well, this is where things started going haywire. In that process and scheme of things, it was determined by the Wyoming Game and Fish Department that Wyoming could ecologically accept 100 wolves and 10 breeding pairs in Wyoming. Well, this is just the beginning of the catastrophe. Now, if these wolves were evenly spread out and so forth, and they were never allowed to flourish, the clue is they had 10 breeding pairs. Those 10 breeding pairs become many more breeding pairs and many, many more wolves over a short period of time. It was also determined beforehand that these wolves, if they were turned loose in Yellowstone Park, that they would never have to leave Yellowstone Park for something to eat, because there was so much wildlife in Yellowstone Park. And yes, there was a tremendous elk herd and moose herd and so forth in Yellowstone Park. Well, we're going to step forward just a little bit. There was never any money appropriated by Congress from any angle, any way, shape, or form to introduce wolves into the lower 48 states. At the time, Newt Gingrich oversaw our Pittman-Robertson's funds, basically our excise tax funds. He undoubtedly was involved because he oversaw the funds. Ted Turner was involved. Jamie Farr was involved. She was the head of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at the time, in 1995. Money was stole. I guess the polite word, folks, is misappropriated. But when we come right down to it, let's get the truth out here. The money was stole. So right off the bat, this whole scheme was illegal. Now, if you work for a corporation and you steal $60 million from them, if you've got that big a corporation, because roughly that's what was stole out of the Pittman-Robertson's funds to bring these wolves illegally into Wyoming. And I happen to be very lucky to have visited with a man out of Kotzebue, Alaska by the name of Jim Rood. Jim Rood may still be alive. The last time I spoke to him, about 8 years ago, he was still doing well. He had a flying service out of Kotzebue, Alaska. He and about 4 others came to the call by the Canadian government to fly and capture wolves. They had no idea why this situation was going on, but these people saw an opportunity to make some money in their flying services, and they flew and they captured wolves. And Jim told me on the phone very emphatically that they didn't have any idea. They learned after the fact, after these wolves were brought into Wyoming here, into specifically Yellowstone Park, what was really going on. And I asked Jim where the monies came from that paid them for these flying services. And he told me that he remembers two specific checks. One came from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and another check actually came from Alaska, believe it or not. Now these people, I can't tell you who any of the rest of these people are. They would never say what their names were. But Jim was very embarrassed and very upset over the deceitful happening that went on to bring these wolves into this part of the country. Now the Fish and Wildlife Service had set up a protocol, basically their own law, that stated how these things had to happen. They're bringing in a specific number of wolves, and they're bringing them into holding pens in Wyoming, in Yellowstone Park. Now, the protocol stated that these wolves had to be held for a length of time. They had to be inoculated for diseases because the wolf carries over 50 transmittable type of diseases, and some of them transmitted to humans very seriously, to humans that even could be fatal. Well, they were never inoculated for any of these diseases. There was a man by the name of Ed Bangs that was involved with this situation, and the Wyoming Game and Fish Department sent a man by the name of Mark Bassino, what I call an environmental terrorist, because this is what these people are environmental terrorists. And they ignored this protocol to see that these wolves didn't carry any of these transmittable type of diseases. It never happened. So after a short little period of time, feeding them roadkill deer and elk and one thing another at those holding pens in Yellowstone Park, these wolves were illegally, and I repeat, illegally turned loose. They didn't stay in Yellowstone Park. They almost immediately took off on the lope, and they very, very quickly were in the valley here where I live, south of east of Yellowstone Park, and elsewhere. They populated themselves into Idaho and into Montana. This was the whole damn hoax. We had a governor at the time in 1995 when this went on by the name of Mike Sullivan. And our governors, Wyoming governors, Idaho governors, Montana governors, had the constitutional authority to nix this whole operation, but with the idea that they wouldn't leave Yellowstone Park and all that, which of course was a phonied up damn scheme from the very, very beginning. Mike Sullivan could have nixed this situation, and so should have the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. But by this time, we had some environmental minded people that were hell-bent on having something their way. Instead of going through proper channels and one thing another to probably find out that, it wasn't going to fly, they raced forward with this illegal operation and brought these animals in here. Within a couple of years, my son and I, Landon, we were doing a lot of lion hunting at the time, just he and I, with a wonderful dog or two, and we were running across considerable number of wolf kills, especially moose and elk. And these wolves were eating entire carcasses. I'm talking about, folks, the full-size femur bones of the leg, the heads, as much as they could eat the head, the entire backbone structure and everything. When wolves, some of these wolves were done, there wouldn't even be hardly a shred of bone left. We were finding these kills. Now, he and I are expert trackers, considerably experienced hunters, and we encounter these situations. And it doesn't take but a short period of time, and we start seeing a decline of our hunting opportunities. In roughly 10 years, our hunting was so bad that there were only small areas that you could go to and find the game that you once found. I'm talking about packing in the backcountry with horses and mules, 20-some miles, and hunting territory in and around, right in and around the border of the east border of Yellowstone Park. We knew exactly what was going on. There was outfitting operations that were seeing the decline, outfitting operations that provided their hunters with tremendous hunting opportunities, and these opportunities were declining. But none of these outfitters would step forward and see that something was done. Basically, they were continuing to book tremendous amount of elk hunters, taking a prey base out. Taking the prey base out, which was the elk, in considerable numbers. Between that and the tremendous amount of predation by the wolves, the opportunities just went from tremendous, the most tremendous hunting you can imagine on earth, to absolutely terrible. In the immediate locales right around the borders of Yellowstone Park. And this was going on just not in Wyoming, but in Idaho and in Montana. And today, we've got 24 years later since 1995. Several years ago, there's a drainage of the North Fork of the Shoshone River here where I live called the Elk Fork Drainage. Now this is a historic and very important wintering grounds for elk. In 1996, Game Warden George Sonny Reese, as I was trapping in the North Fork, told me that he came out the day before out of Elk Fork counting elk. They always went in there in January and counted elk, and my granddad went in there a number of years with them. They'd go in with snowmobiles away and snowshoes and skis, and they had just a simple area there in the valley where they could get on vantage points and count elk in the valley. You understand this drainage now is about 20 miles long. It's a big drainage, but they just counted an area about 3.5, 4 miles in. Whatever they could see from there, they used that as a measure of the available game for hunting purposes in this part of the country. Sonny told me that they'd counted 1,100 head elk. Now they always counted between about 400 and 700, and he was blowing out of his mind. They'd counted 1,100. My granddad didn't happen to go along on that particular trip. And right near to there for years, there were a holding pen, kind of a catch holding pen set up for elk to coax elk in there and eat hay and collar them to be able to, watch the travel routes of where these elk ended up and one thing and another. My granddad and I were involved with that with the Forest Service and the Game and Fish. That was done away with within a year or two after this tremendous count of elk and so forth. I'm reiterating these things because they're ever so important to what I'm talking about. Last year, and this has been a gradual thing because of the tremendous amount of wolves that we have in the valley here, we've got 60 plus wolves in this valley at this point in time, and this has been going on for about 4 or 5 years with these numbers. The wolf activity is so heavy in that drainage and elsewhere that it has pushed these elk that migrate from Yellowstone Park out of that historic wintering ground and completely out of the valley. I'm reiterating the Elk Fork drainage because this has been a historic counting place, historic wintering ground for these elk and elsewhere in this valley. I used to count elk the late 50s, early 60s, visible from the North Fork Highway here over about a 30-mile stretch in the wintertime with my granddad. And we would count 3, 4, 5,000 head elk visible from the highway. I was about 15 miles west of here yesterday and counted a little group of right close to 100 head of elk. This is a remnant, a little remnant group of elk that are still there.